Hi, welcome to Season 1, Episode 4 of Impact Effectively. And I've entitled this episode, Are You Buying Into You? If you've not been watching or listening to earlier podcasts in this series, or indeed my other series of podcasts, Everyday NLP Bites, I'm Florence Madden. I'm a management development trainer, an NLP trainer and coach based in Cumbria in the north of England. This series of podcasts is based on my book, The Intention Impact Conundrum, which in turn is based on a course that I run in the lovely Lake District called Personal Effectiveness at Work. So through this series, I am looking at how we make our good intentions match up with the impact that we make on other people. When I run courses, when I meet people, it's very common when people introduce themselves or they take part in some sort of course activity to be quite self-critical, to point out what they don't do well or make some joke at their own expense. Now, I recognize that part of that is a desire not to appear arrogant. There's a bit of rapport building there. And there's also a big part of our culture that encourages people to do exactly that. The problem is that these things that may not be said entirely seriously are taken seriously by our unconscious mind, and it affects how we see ourselves and therefore how we present ourselves to other people. The author Louise L says, if you've been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked, try approving of yourself and see what happens. So that's the theme that I want to run with through this podcast. How can we make some changes? I recently asked a group to write a letter to themselves, encouraging them to think how well, in fact, they were going to be able to use their learning from the course. They seemed to enjoy writing the letter, but hearing it read back, a lot of them found that quite what they described as cringeworthy. Because we have this feeling of, it can be sometimes feel more comfortable to be self-critical than actually self-encouraging. So as Louise L indicates, I wonder what would happen if we turn that on its head. And there are good reasons for that. There is quite well-established links between how we think about ourselves and our internal biology. And this is something that's a huge area of interest and study right now. Two of the creators and developers of NLP, John Grinder and Robert Dilts, just to speak of two people, are looking in their work at this link between how we think and how we talk about ourselves and what actually happens at a cellular level in our body. And I suppose the ultimate aim of their work is how, in changing the way in which we think, the way in which we speak, the images that we create of ourselves in our own mind, how that can be used to promote good health or indeed to overcome disease. Something that's a great deal more obvious to us is when someone, us, another person, is not feeling confident about themselves. Whatever's happening at a cellular level, we can actually see that in the way in which they present themselves. We can see it in their body language. We can hear it in their voice and in their choice of words. And it doesn't have to be that way. But before we look at how we change it, let's look a wee bit more at the effect of it. So if you think about somebody going to do a presentation, for example, If they don't feel they are good enough to do that, as I mentioned before, we'll hear it in their voice, we'll see it in their body language, in their choice of words. And if you're someone who is in the audience of that presentation, or if you've experienced that, you'll know that it also has an impact on the person on the, or persons on the receiving end of that also. On the other hand, if someone stands up to speak who is comfortable in their own skin, confident, not cocky or arrogant, but confident in themselves, that for most people is far more relaxing to watch and to listen to, because it's evident to us how that person feels about themselves and what they're speaking about. And if the audience asks them questions or they're challenged in some way, they are able to listen and they are able to be flexible. Contrast that as well with someone who's perhaps cocky or arrogant. That probably creates a very different set of feelings when we're on the receiving end of that. And if that person's view or what they're saying, if they're asked questions about or if it's challenged, then often you will perhaps experience a bit of their brittleness, perhaps even a slightly aggressive reply. So what we're looking at here is how we build our confidence in ourselves that makes us at ease with ourselves. And starting point for that is to notice the language that we're using about ourselves. So if we're learning something new, rather than think, oh, I got that wrong, is think, no, I got that bit right. This bit needs a bit more work. Because balanced feedback to ourselves is important too, particularly to avoid that cockiness or that arrogance. Yeah, we want the encouragement of realizing what we've done well already, as well as being fair and being positive and being constructive about what we still have to learn. Those of you that are watching or listening to this that have children will probably immediately recognize that's exactly how you would encourage your child to learn something. Encourage them for what they've managed to do so far, and also how they can get to the next step. I don't believe that needs to be so different for us as adults either. So in terms of beliefs, in the second season of my podcasts, Everyday NLP Bites, I look at each of the presuppositions of NLP. If you're not familiar with these are simply resourceful beliefs that we can choose to hold about ourselves or other people. So I'm not going to go into these now, but I would encourage you to have a look or a listen at those, because these are really useful, productive ways, as I say, about looking not just at ourselves, but also how we think or how we look at and how we experience other people too. And going forward from this, what I would encourage you to do is just to notice. Notice your language. Notice how you're speaking about yourself. And if that's not fair, if that's not positive, if that's not encouraging, think about how you might reword that. Someone I mentioned earlier, John Grinder, said that the barriers to personal effectiveness are threefold. They are muscle tension, the way that we go when we feel angry or nervous. Foveal vision, when we hone in on one thing. So if it's ourselves, focusing entirely on what we got wrong rather than taking a wider picture. And the third thing he said was inner chatter. And by that, I believe he meant that internal critic that points out what we're not good enough to do, what we have got wrong. And it doesn't have to be that way. When we start to change the way in which we speak about and to ourselves, we can relax that muscle tension. We can take a wider, fairer view about how we've done things. And we can turn that inner critic into an inner coach. And by that I mean, rather than saying, you got that wrong, saying, how about you did it this way? And this is not magic. It is simply practice. The more that we do it, the more that we notice our language and make the changes we need to make, then our unconscious mind is getting a very, very different message. And the more that we do that, the more that we practice that, the more we will be buying into ourselves. And when we're buying into ourselves, it is more likely that other people will buy into us. I want to finish today on a quote from the Dalai Lama this time. And he says, with realization of one's own potential and self-confidence in one's ability, one can build a better world. Probably starting with our own world in the first instance. So thank you for watching or listening to this podcast. If you're interested to find out more about the courses I run, about my books, and the other services that I provide, you can get all of that at my website, which is www.florencemadden.co.uk. And I hope you'll join me next week for the next podcast in this series. For now, thank you.